This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.
Hello and welcome to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. 2 weeks ago, we started previewing conferences here on the podcast. Last week, one of those conferences canceled its fall football season. So this week, we're going to try to get back on the horse. My guest is Max Olson from The Athletic. Max is a terrific national college football writer, but he does an especially good job with the Big 12, so we'll talk to Max about the Big 12. Is the gap closing between Oklahoma and the rest of the conference? Which teams are the wild cards in a conference that typically produces at least one surprising contender? How good can Oklahoma State be after a rocky offseason? And we talk a lot about Texas. Again, sorry, or you're welcome, depending on your perspective. Thanks for listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. You can find us on Westwood One Podcast, Apple Podcast, just about anywhere you like to get your podcast. Please subscribe, and if so inclined, give us a good review. It helps college football fans find us, and it helps us find more college football fans. And away we go. Joining me this week on the podcast is the great Max Olson. He is a national college football writer for The Athletic, but he's got a lot of knowledge on the Big 12, and Max cut his teeth, some might say, in the Big 12. And who knows, maybe Nebraska will be back in the Big 12. You're living in Lincoln now, so, that's the thing.
God. Of course you set me up like that to start.
Sorry. Anyway, thanks for doing this, Max.
Of course, buddy. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I do like to bring Max on. It's been a tradition. He has been our Big 12 preview guy, I think, since David Ubben moved to Tennessee. So
that's fair.
You were the first choice. I'm just being honest with you. But
no, Jake Trotter stopped taking your calls, and David Ubben moved, and so here I am.
Yeah, that was pretty much it. Jake moves to Cleveland. David moves to Tennessee. Who's next on the list? There's Max. But Max does a great job of breaking down the Big 12, so we have him on to continue to break down the Big 12. But unlike in past years, we've done this thing in some different ways. And really in the last couple of years, we've gone so deep that we're like talking about every team. And, I don't know if we want to do that this year. I do want to talk a little bit more off the field stuff because, listen, 2 weeks ago I did a Pac-12 preview and an ACC preview, and only one of those is standing. So,
I was going to ask you from the jump here, just how much would we like to agree to suspend all disbelief?
And I think that's where we're going to be eventually. I want to talk at the top a little bit about some of what is going on in the Pac-12 specifically. You wrote about how the testing element, because that's obviously been a big part of where this is going to end up eventually. I think that there are the conditions around the country and in states and in communities in many ways will determine whether we play more than the situations in athletic facilities, which are going really well. I think that the collapse could come from the outside. You talk to Big 12 ADs and administrators about where testing is on their campuses and how it could be affected by their communities. And what did you glean?
First of all, it's funny that when we talk about this stuff, we're not even really no one's really having a conversation about like, what is it going to take to complete the season, right? We're just trying to get through the next 4 weeks here. We're just trying to figure out what does it take to play one game and kick this off and try to build some momentum from there. And, I think in the next 4 weeks for the Big 12, the really important thing, obviously students returning to campus is, certainly a real concern that can kind of jeopardize the semblance of a bubble that these these football teams have sort of built within their program and their facilities. But you talk to folks around the Big 12, and testing capacity is a real concern. When they held their meetings last Tuesday, and kind of had that long day of debate about do we side with the Big 10 and Pac-12 and pulling the plug, or do we try to keep going? One of the outcomes of that meeting, in agreeing that, hey, let's stay the course, is let's back this up by enhancing our medical protocols. And a big part of that is that Big 12 is committing, and their schools are committing to testing 3 times a week during the season. And, that sounds great. That sounds like a really good plan, but the execution of that is so important and somewhat beyond their control, because, these 10 Big 12 schools all have 10 different plans for how they're going to do their testing, where they're sourcing their supplies. They all experience different turnaround times on their test results. And so, wrote about basically how does this work? And there's still, at this point, there's still optimism that the testing supplies they're going to be in okay shape here when they get started with the season. And they're really kind of just crossing their fingers that there can be more innovation, and there can be, better, faster testing that's cheaper and that becomes more reliable over time. They're really hoping that can be kind of a breakthrough here in the next month or two that allows the season to be possible. And I think that's a big reason why the Big 12 is still hanging in there.
Right, and one of those breakthroughs a lot of people saw over the weekend. We are recording this on a Tuesday afternoon, so a few days ago there was a lot of good vibes about saliva test breakthroughs out of Rutgers and then Yale, and how those could be readily available. But what readily available is, and how they are distributed, and how quickly, it's hard to know. Like, even within those stories, like, there was not a lot of definitive, yes, we will have these in consumers' hands within X amount of days or within X amount of weeks. So, but absolutely reason to be optimistic that these type of things could be a big part of why we end up having football. And, then of course there's another argument that goes into, should they be taking these testing capacities and resources away from the community in general? Right. And then, of course, then you go into the argument of, well, they're paying for them, so to a certain degree, if it wasn't for their money, these tests wouldn't exist. I think the NBA and the pro leagues have sort of used that a lot. I don't know. I just wanted to difference between surveillance testing and important testing for people that are symptomatic and are testing positive, stuff like that, right? I mean, you definitely want to be mindful of that, and that's politically sensitive. And Ralph, just from covering the whole country here, like you saw today, Mac Brown said North Carolina, which is certainly reckoning with their own campus problem, said they're going to test once a week between now and the end of the football season. So, these leagues are also not going to totally maybe land in the same spot in terms of their own testing protocols and, what's necessary to be safe and what's good enough, Yeah. So at this point, well, the last thing I'll say is, for people who are sort of wondering what the lay of the land is right now, my sense of it is, from talking to people, that it'll be interesting to see, and this is not super breaking news, like, we'll see what happens as students return to campus. I don't know if any of the medical situation is going to change, any medical information is going to change, but if you get a lot of outbreaks on campus, I think that could be a trigger point to some schools within these conferences. Because it's even not, remember, like, we talk about it as a conference by conference, but even within the conferences, if the more you talk to people, the more you realize, just like in the Big 10, though maybe not so much in the Pac-12, like, not everybody even in the conference is in the same place. And I've heard even in the ACC that there are some schools that are maybe a little more worried about what they're seeing at North Carolina than other schools. And even in the Big 12, the Big 12 has been portrayed as on the fence. I've heard as recently as this morning that there might still be some on the fence-ness in the Big 12 going forward. You're more embedded in that conference than I am, so I don't know if you've heard similar things, but we're not out of the woods yet. I don't know when the next look-in period is. I think the next big step is, can they avoid big events that cause reconsideration? more than, hey, the medical information is going to change, or, maybe the testing piece of it does change drastically. So any more thoughts on that before we start? Again, we completely suspend disbelief.
Yeah, that's the challenging thing, right? Is I think it's a great thing to bring up here, the sort of look-in element of, okay, well, they really are constantly reevaluating this stuff, and that makes it hard for you and I to cover when you don't know sort of when, how frequently those meetings might pop up and when the discourse is going to change and stuff. But you certainly do wonder what's the thing that triggers them to, whether it's the conference's medical experts saying, hold on, you got a red light here, we got a problem. Or if it's as we get closer and closer to the deadline of kickoff here, as this clock keeps ticking, is there just going to be more discomfort that, hey, there hasn't been the improvement that we were really praying for here over the last month? So, fortunately, you've got these, the SEC obviously is waiting until the end of September. You do wonder a little bit, can these leagues, because they are so desperate to try and make this work, is there also the option that they could just sort of keep delaying and trying to, wait until maybe the end of September to try and hope that things are in a better spot?
Yeah, last thing I'll say on that, I did have a conversation with somebody who is on that piece of this, the idea of how much can you delay. And I do think there is a certain sensitivity to doing to their athletes in these other conferences what happened to the Big Ten, what you're sort of hearing out of the Big Ten, but maybe even worse, and that is, how long can we tell kids to prepare and then not have a payoff at the end? So I do think that you're starting to get a little bit of that conversation too, which is, boy, we have to keep going forward, but at a certain point, do you keep going forward? And
I mean, are you going to ask your kids to practice for 8 weeks? You know what I mean? Right. Until they finally get to play a game. Like it's a tough balancing act.
In other words, if you're the SEC or the Big 12, can you cancel on September 20th? Can you so there is right. there is that element that I think administrators are struggling with of I know we want to wait a long time, but is there a point of no return here? In other words, if we get so close at this point, do we look at it 2 weeks before and say we're full go, and now we're full go, unless, of course, again, something dramatic happens to change our minds? I don't know. I don't have good answers for that, but I just wanted to throw that one piece out there. Now we're going to start.
No, for sure.
Now we're going to start lying to ourselves and pretending everything is going to be great, and we're going to have a football season in the Big 12.
Hell yeah.
Oklahoma has won this conference, I believe, is it 5 straight years now? Max?
It's 5 to 10 years now. It's somewhere in between there.
Yeah, I mean, they just keep winning the damn thing every year. It did seem like last year, the margin between Oklahoma and the rest of the conference had sort of shrunk, but they are still, without question, the beast in this conference. So do you think the margin gets any smaller this year when you have a redshirt freshman quarterback? They've already lost some key players. There's a report that Kennedy from The Athletic, your coworker Jason Kersey, that Kennedy Brooks, the great running back, is going to opt out. They've had some injuries. Is the gap closing a little more this year between Oklahoma and the rest of the conference, or at least the next tier of the conference?
Yeah, and they also still have some, key players like Ronnie Perkins suspended for half the season too. So yes, I think I think that's sort of the right way to frame the conference going into it here. Is the window opening up for anybody else? Because I agree with you. The gap was a little bit smaller last year. I think a big reason for that was Jalen Hurts, who put up great numbers, but if you watched him, he wasn't playing at the level that Kyler Murray and Baker Mayfield did. And Alex Grinch, made strides defensively with Oklahoma, but that was still year one for them. And so while I do think they'll be a little bit better on that side of the ball, even with some key players that they've lost, like Kenneth Murray and Parnell Motley, you do wonder, Lincoln Riley has had that thing rolling. I'm not going to bet against Spencer Rattler and Oklahoma's quarterbacks and just the level of play that they can bring. But is just Oklahoma just a little bit weaker this year? And we'll figure out pretty quickly. I mean, the schedule they've got starts with Kansas State and Iowa State, followed by Texas. So those are, I think, 3 top 25 caliber teams. And that's a real test for Spencer Rattler right out the chute there. And This is, I think it's still going to be a really good Oklahoma team, but at Oklahoma State and at Texas and even to some degree at Iowa State, they're looking at this year and saying, we've got a really good team and this is our chance.
Okay, so let's hop on a team, and Kansas State fans are going to be giddy if they do listen to this, because now we're going to give Kansas State some run. Because when you said Kansas State, you're thinking it could be a top 25 team. I think that's a little off the board of consensus. And again, the Big 12, it's always hard to find consensus other than like Oklahoma's really good and Kansas is really bad.
As you know well, Ralph, what are we talking about with top 25?
Oh, that's a good point.
We talk about who's left.
That's a good point, and which is a good place for me to say that, yes, the top 25 is going to be coming out next week, and the preseason top 25 is going to include all of FBS. But once games start being played, all those teams that are no longer scheduled to play disappear. So anyway, right. So we'll throw that out there. But it does sound like Europe probably, even framing it away from the T25 conversation, it does sound like you're maybe a little higher on Kansas State than maybe, again, the consensus would be.
Yeah, I think the next tier in the Big 12 is interesting. You've seen people sort of give Baylor the benefit of the doubt because they, had the big year last year. Going to the Sugar Bowl, going to the Big 12 title game. Obviously, Charlie Brewer's back, and I think that offense is going to be pretty fun to watch with what Larry Fedora, the direction they want to take him in. That's a more natural thing for Charlie Brewer from what he played in high school. But the fact that they lose 9 starters on defense and then have no spring ball to sort of work through that, as good as Dave Aranda and Ron Roberts are, I sort of see, there's just inevitably, it's just such a hard reset for that program that I think there's a bit of a drop off there. And so, who are the ones that sort of rise above there? I think that next tier of teams is probably Kansas State and TCU that I think are going to have a chance to kind of be the wild cards in this Big 12 race where you saw year one for Chris Kleiman. They were several wins better than I think anybody around there expected they would be. And that's, makes sense. The guy has a lot of national title rings for a reason. But I think what they've got coming back, you've got Wyatt Hubert, one of the best D linemen in the Big 12. Skylar Thompson's a senior and a guy they really, really trust. You've got some skill talent. Like, I think Kansas State's going to be a team that nobody enjoys playing. And I kind of, in TCU, very much the wild card in this thing, because it's just hard to picture TCU staying, sort of staying out of that race, staying, kind of having another, kind of mediocre season for a third year in a row. I think they're going to bounce back. And what they've got on defense is always good, but they've got some really special playmakers on D this year, and they've added some really interesting pieces on offense. So those two teams, I think, can play the spoiler in this Big 12 race a bit, and I wouldn't be surprised if one of them really kind of injects himself in the conversation.
Is that this conversation assuming that Iowa State is a contender? Because I'm looking at it and going, okay, well, Oklahoma's Oklahoma. When you say, who are the wild cards, and your wild cards are Kansas State and TCU, I know Texas and Oklahoma State are going to be considered sort of the second tier, the contenders to Oklahoma. But I'm wondering, where is Iowa State in that? And have we gotten to the point where we are assuming Iowa State is going to be in contention?
They kind of burned me on that last year a little bit. I really thought that last year Iowa State was really sort of putting all the pieces together.
Me too, by the way. I had them playing in the conference championship game. I thought that they could, and they would listen. They had a whole bunch of close losses.
They did, and that's kind of life in the Big 12. You're going to play a ton of really close games, and once again last year, they got off to a little bit of a slow start, and that Iowa rivalry game always sort of factors into that. Well, you've yanked that off the schedule. Now, of course, Iowa State couldn't make it easy on themselves. They had to schedule one of the best group of 5 teams they could possibly find in the Raging Cajuns of Louisiana. So, that's a pretty awesome game and challenge to start off their season. Billy Napier's done an awesome job there. But you talk to everyone around Iowa State, and they just tell you straight out, we've got a really damn good team this year. And that's not just because of Brock Purdy. As much as he's really on pace here to go down as the best quarterback in program history, but they've got Breece Hall coming back, who was one of the most dynamic freshmen in the conference last year at running back. They really like Xavier Hutchinson, the junior college receiver they brought in, and the options they have there. They really like what they have up front on both sides of the ball, and that's a big improvement from where they started a couple years ago. And even with losing some important pieces like Marcel Spears and Rui Lima, I think defensively they've got enough there. So yeah, Iowa State, they feel really, really good about where they're at. They have more depth and competition for spots than they've ever had. It's the question of, can they figure out how to put all the pieces together and play with some consistency? Because we've seen them, spring those big upsets in October seemingly every year. It's just, can you play like that in November and September and with some, real week-to-week consistency?
It's the margin of victory, the difference between these teams in the Big 12. I feel like I say this every year in the Big 12. I don't think any of the Power 5 conferences have such a narrow margin between sort of the top, the middle, and sort of the little past the middle, right? Again, not Kansas at the bottom, but even West Virginia in a year that was a massive rebuild, that we thought would be a massive rebuild last year, was, a little more competitive than we thought they were going to be. And at this point, Texas Tech, like, what are they going to be under Matt Wells in a second year? Like, even in years when we sort of dismiss those two programs, figuring, well, they need to get it straight, especially West Virginia, they upset some things, and they won a couple of games here and there. So, why don't we just throw out those two programs, and let me I assume we're looking at them being toward the bottom of the Big 12, but can either one of them, do you think, make a little bit of a step forward, and all of a sudden now they are a wild card?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I think those are probably two programs where, there is such a rebuilding effort going on that's where it really hurts you to lose spring ball too, is just there's a lot of work you wanted to get done this offseason. You weren't totally able to get all of it done. That being said, West Virginia, like when you talked to Neil Brown last summer when they were kind of getting going, he's like, we're going to be good. We just don't know when. And I think you saw as the season went on, like they were a really frisky team in November that was able to, they knocked TCU out of going to a bowl game. They won some key games in November when they went with Jarrett Diggey at quarterback. I think they're going to keep building, and I think they're going to be better. And I think that's one of those programs where you've got a really, really sharp head coach who's going to figure out how to navigate all of the unique challenges that come with trying to play this season. And, with Texas Tech, it's pretty simple. I think Alan Bowman's really good. And I think at times as a freshman, he really, really showed that under Cliff Kingsbury. And so that dude has had just the worst luck possible with injuries, and got hurt really early last year and was knocked out for the whole year. So when he's right and he's healthy, I think he makes them pretty dangerous, and they've got some dudes on offense. As always with Texas Tech, you've got to figure out that defense and how to just get a little bit better. But I think if Alan Bowman's healthy, they're definitely going to beat some teams.
This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.
All right, so there's Texas. The funny thing is, because the Big 12 is so small and you're so good at this, we actually might be able to hit all the Big 12 teams.
We can try.
Yeah. Because
I don't have much to say about Kansas. They're going to be pretty bad, Ralph.
So there it is.
You can leave it at that if you want.
So we've hit on Kansas too. Yeah, let's talk about Texas for a second, and then we'll hit on Oklahoma State. So Texas last year was probably overhyped, because of what they did the year before. My sense of it was that they almost overachieved the year before, so maybe last year was going to be a year of that was sort of stagnation, where they weren't necessarily going to get a lot better. Now it ends up they had a ton of injuries on defense, and they end up getting a little worse. They did salvage it at the end and looked like, had some pretty interesting things coming in. So it's so hard to figure out. I mean, we overanalyze and Texas so much to the point where I feel like it's just impossible to get a read because, again, we're just constantly, just dissecting Texas. So where do you think Tom Herman is? Because in my mind, like, there's a lot of pressure on him this year to come up with a big season. But what exactly is a big season?
Yeah, it's so interesting the way where the standard is at Texas, where it's like, ultimately they finish like tied for third in the Big 12. They finish inside the top 25. They
barely,
whipped a really good Utah team that could have made the playoff.
Yeah.
And when they played, they played LSU as well as anybody early in the season, right? So like there were some moments there where you're like, okay, this is how good Texas could be. But I'm not going to sit here and make a bunch of excuses for them. They should have been a lot better last year. And, part of it is like you knew they were going to be young on defense because they had a lot of sophomores in starting roles. And then you get hit with some injuries and it just messes you up. But it's crazy that you still have a good season by a lot of standards, and you still dump more than half your staff, right? And there's all this pressure and hot seat talk and stuff. I don't think Tom Herman's actually in the hot seat in any like meaningful way here, unless they are just truly awful in the next season they play. But it's a fascinating spot because this is the year. And Tom Herman will say this straight up. This is the year they circled on the calendar when they got to Texas. You've got Sam Ehlinger as a senior. You've got these, top 5 recruiting classes that you've brought in, and now those guys are in their second and third year in the program, and a lot of them have played starting roles so far. So this was sort of the plan all along, that they thought this team could really be their best team. Now, a pandemic wasn't part of the plan, and dumping 7 coaches wasn't part of that plan either. So this offseason has brought a lot of change. I think some of it really positive. I think Mike Yurcich taking over the offense for Tom Herman is going to be, a positive change for sure. And I think Chris Ash is capable of really simplifying what they're doing on defense and letting those guys play, more fast and physical. But it's a fascinating spot because this is the time to take advantage. This is the time to really make a run at Oklahoma. But as you know, at this conference, you pretty much have to beat Oklahoma twice to win it. And so can Texas kind of, they have all of this talent. Can they make good on that potential and play with some consistency? It's, up until all the stuff happened in Stillwater this offseason, I would have said, Texas was the most fascinating team in this conference and one of the most interesting in the country. And I think that's probably still the case.
Before we move over to Stillwater, I got to ask you about, was the situation, listen, Tom Herman just did a house cleaning.
Yeah.
Was the situation with Todd Orlando just, hey, everybody's got to go? Sorry. So you're part of everybody. Because I can understand the offensive change, and I think Ash and Herman have worked together. They are very close. They are friends. Mm-hmm. They worked together at Ohio State, and even before that, I think they may have had some ties through Iowa State, possibly. I might be getting that wrong.
Yeah, that's
there.
Right.
Okay,
that's right. When they were both young guys at Iowa State.
Right.
Yeah.
So they've had long time. So I understand the idea of bringing Ash in, and what Ash does maybe is a little different from Orlando. But Orlando, I keep going back to when USC picked up Orlando, and I'm thinking that's a pretty good buy low situation there for USC. Mm-hmm. Just a couple of years ago, we thought Todd Orlando was doing a really good job at multiple schools. So I don't know. Do you have any insight behind, was the Orlando thing simply like, hey, we got to just flush everything out here, so, sorry, but you got to go too? Or was there something more specific about why Orlando also, they cut bait on Orlando also, who had been with Herman at Houston?
Yeah, it's a really tough thing because, Tom Herman is at Texas, for a lot of reasons, but Todd Orlando is, provided a lot of them. I mean, what they did at Houston together, in stopping Lamar Jackson and Baker Mayfield and winning some really big games is the reason why he's there. So there is a lot of loyalty there that they've built up over time. And Todd Orlando did not forget how to coach defense. I think that was a great hire for USC, and I think Clay Helton's going to be really happy with how that works. It's kind of a tricky thing. First of all, we know that the Big 12 can kind of chew you up and spit you out, and
that is true.
I think probably Brent Venables would vouch for that, right? Not that he did a horrible job at Oklahoma, but it's just a really, really challenging league, and there have been some good coaches that have come through and have walked away really frustrated with their experience. But I think another thing with Texas is like, you have all those injuries, and you could have just said, hey, we were really banged up, but we've got everything we need. Let's just run it back. And that is not what Tom Herman chose to do. And I think when I asked him about that this spring, I think a big thing that their struggle sort of brought out was he felt like their defense was not really getting their young players ready to play right away. And he sort of watched all over the country as you see these true freshmen playing and making an impact. And their guys were not ready to do that. And is that because the defense is too complicated? Yeah, to some degree. I think it's a little bit of a mix of bad luck there with what Texas ran into. And then, there was just some sort of key moments last season. You got 3rd and 17 against LSU and you zero blitz and you get burned for a touchdown and lose the game, right? Where people sort of start to lose faith in what you're calling defensively. And it's just a tough spot for Orlando, but I think he's still a good coach, and I think he's going to do pretty well in Southern California.
So this is a tangent because you just brought up an interesting point here. The idea that if you are Texas, like the elite programs get significant contributions from freshmen. That doesn't mean they have like a bunch of freshman starters, but we think of as elite programs, the teams that contend for national championships, are able to plug true freshmen into roles that are either starting roles or complementary roles, and they are able to contribute immediately. And I think that is one of the things that I think you're right is probably holding Texas. Now, you could also make the argument that maybe Texas is not getting those kind of contributions from their freshman class because it's not as good as it should be on the front end, because they're not recruiting at a level that they should. They're getting those really elite players, those high 4 and 5 stars that are able to step right in. So maybe it's a recruiting issue, but it's interesting that maybe there's a little bit of or Herman looked at as a little bit of a development issue that we need. If we're going to compete at the highest level, we need to have some of these good-looking bodies that come in, like, that we look at and think that kid could be ready to play. That kid actually needs to be ready to play.
Yeah, and Ralph, you're a smart guy. I assume you're a fan of the blue chip ratio, right?
Without question.
So Texas is now top 5 in the country in blue chip ratio. They're over 60% of their roster is 4 or 5 star recruits. So they've brought in, at least by the recruiting industry standards, they've brought in the raw talent on the level of those teams that are contending for playoff stuff. And so I'm sure it's frustrating when Tom Herman plays LSU and Derek Stingley shuts down Colin Johnson, and you're like, well, why can't our freshmen do that? Right? Or comes in and plug in Tyler Davis at the nose and be fine. Alabama can go with freshman linebackers and get by. And so I think if you're Texas and you're recruiting at that level and you really are starting to bring together these classes of really freaky athletes, I think you have to look at your talent and say, look, while we've got more depth and competition now, so that those guys don't have to start right away, that's a good thing. When you're raising the level of recruiting, but those guys aren't totally ready to play right away, then yeah, it's a little bit of a problem. And I think Texas, the staff changes they made and really shaking up their staff, that all goes back to really player development. And they've got a great strength coach in Nancy McKnight, but were they doing the best job they possibly could of getting guys ready to play? No, not really.
Right. So then the other part of that conversation becomes Texas is not quite on the level of Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, maybe Clemson now when it comes to recruiting, though their numbers are getting up there. But they should be at a level where they're not losing 1 to 2 Big 12 games to teams that clearly aren't recruiting at that level every year. And they're still sort of in that weird quagmire, right? Where listen, we're more talented. We have to stop losing to these teams that are clearly less talented than us. We might not be ready to knock off Alabama, and maybe we showed that we are close to, we can be close on a given day to LSU, but boy, we have to stop losing to Iowa State or Kansas State or insert second-tier Big 12 team.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And, that's been certainly the challenge for Texas for quite a while here is just you have they have had all this talent for quite a while. And it's just how do you sort of break this, cycle of kind of under-delivering on on the expectations there. And, I think it's, I think they've brought some stability there, which was so important. I mean, there was a stretch of time where Texas had, 7 offensive play callers in 7 years. And now they have a new one again this year in Mike Yurcich. So when you have as much coaching change as they had in going from the Mac Brown era to the Charlie Strong era to Tom Herman, it's hard to build, when you're always starting over. And so I think you're starting to see Texas finally kind of get to that place. And that's a big reason why Oklahoma is so damn good, is just that they're not changing what they're doing offensively ever since Lincoln Riley got there in 2015. And, they've, the longer Alex Grinch is there, I think the better they're going to be defensively. And so if Texas can kind of get that stability and start winning in that 9, 10, 11 wins level where you're sort of consistently going to the Big 12 title game and you're always in the mix there, that stability I think will help you cure just that inconsistency and that sort of knack that Texas has to disappoint.
Last one is, how significant is the commitment from the 5-star quarterback? I can't remember the kid's name now.
Quinn Ewers, yeah.
Yeah, a Texas player, 5-star, probably a 2022 class, considered maybe the best player in the 2022 class, or certainly maybe the best quarterback. So, again, this is a very elite level player, that player that could be looked at as a a program-changing type player. So that Texas gets that guy when it hasn't been necessarily getting that very elite, top of the line, number one recruit in the state of Texas type player. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's a big deal. This kid was just a sophomore last year and was really, really good at South Lake Carroll in the DFW area. He's still got 2 more years of high school, but you watch the tape and he is just a very effortless thrower, a very gifted kid. There's you watch it and he's not as tall, but there is you sort of see some Trevor Lawrence-ish stuff with him, with just the kind of the natural arm talent. And that's a big win for Texas. And a lot of times when you talk about like the windows with this stuff, it's like, all right, well, Sam Ehlinger's a senior, you got to strike now, right? But I think Texas has built their QB room into a lot better shape going forward here. Where they've got an experienced backup in Casey Thompson, and it's hard to hold on to those guys. They've got 2 really, really talented freshmen, 2 top 100 recruits in Hudson Card and Jaquin and Jackson. And so you take those guys and you bring in Ewers in a couple years. Like I think their quarterback situation is looking really good now, which for much of this decade, Ralph, was sort of a punchline. I think they've gotten it to a good spot where, if you can keep those guys in your program and develop them and not throw them into the fire as true freshmen, I think you have a chance to really build some long-term, future success there. Okay, so
all the Big 12 fans are now pleased enough of Texas. We haven't
hit
Oklahoma State yet, and Oklahoma State is, had a weird offseason, obviously, with Mike Gundy putting his foot in his mouth a couple of times and getting called out by his star running back. But the good news is he's got a star running back to call him out. Like, the fact that they have Chuba Hubbard still there is pretty cool, and Tylan Wallace coming back, the great receiver. Interesting quarterback situation there. We always think of Oklahoma State as they're going to lead with their offense, and the pieces are in place there to have a pretty damn good offense. We always know that they're probably going to be piecing it together on defense, but maybe there's some pieces there to be a little better than that. They could be a trendy pick to win the Big 12, a trendy pick to maybe even have a 2011 type season and make a playoff run. But where do you think, after a weird offseason, Oklahoma State is going into the season?
Yeah, I think like if you stick to like sizing them up on paper, you're like, wow, this team has got everything they need. I think Spencer Sanders is going to be a lot better as a sophomore. I think he didn't do a great job taking care of the ball sometimes, and especially in the games they lost last year. But that kid is as a dual threat quarterback, I think is really talented. Chuba Hubbard, even when everyone knew the ball was going to Chuba Hubbard last year, he still just destroyed defenses and running for 2,000 yards and being the best running back in the country. And so he's back. Tylan Wallace comes back from ACL, has been one of the best receivers in the Big 12 ever since he became a starter. You've got some good players around him like Dylan Stoner. they've lost a couple guys on the offensive line, but everybody's back on defense pretty much, other than AJ Green in corner. So there's a lot of reason to believe Oklahoma State, just on paper, looks like one of the best teams in the Big 12. But when you go beyond that, it's just real interesting because like even yesterday, Mike Gundy had a Zoom and was asked, first time he talked to me in a long time, and he was asked sort of how has he addressed things since Chuba Hubbard and his teammates called out Gundy. And he's like, yeah, I've just been listening to them more. Everything else is fine. We're back to normal. And so can they kind of keep the peace through a season like this? Or are some of those issues that came to the surface this summer where Oklahoma State went so far as to investigate Mike Gundy and figure out what are the problems in our program? Can they sort of move past that stuff and kind of have some harmony this season and kind of stick to their shared goal? Or is there going to be are there going to be more issues? Because I do think Chuba Hubbard and his teammates in learning from all of that, like if they see things aren't changing, if they see that this program is not where it needs to be, I think they're going to call it out and continue to. And so can those guys, like, will they be put in a position where they have to? I think it's a really interesting problem there. And I don't know. It's an extremely talented team. They've also got an ESPN Plus documentary crew following them around every day and sharing with the world what's going on there every Wednesday, I believe. So that element of it is really interesting. It's all going to be televised, and the stakes are just really, really high. And I think this team's really good, but it's a question of, can Mike Gundy kind of keep the peace there and stay on the same page with his kids?
Yeah, especially in a year where buy-in is so much more important than even normally, right? Like you're asking more of your team this year than 100%. Maybe ever before. You're asking them to be committed in a way on and off the field. You're asking them to deal with more, maybe not maybe adversity and inconveniences, right? To just put a season on. And of course, what will be tested is, and I don't have their schedule in front of me because all the schedules have changed. So my poor Phil Steele's magazine has been devastated. But I do wonder, like for a team like Oklahoma State, what is the level of adversity they can stand? In other words, if you lose an early game, if especially in the Big 12, where God knows, so much of the Big 12 is just spin the wheel and see what happens, right? Like so many games in the Big 12 just come down to like a missed kick or a missed tackle here or there. Even the good teams are going to have at least a handful of them. So you do sort of wonder if like things go a little you lose one game early in a season like this where you're asking your players to sacrifice so much, if they just sort of go like, you know what? Yeah, maybe not. Maybe we're not quite as committed as we thought. So having a team with a delicate psyche heading into this season could be even more problematic than in other seasons because you're just asking so much more of the dedication level out of your players.
Yeah, it's a great point. And it's the way the schedule sets up for them. They're going to play Tulsa, West Virginia, Kansas, and then and then Baylor.
That's a good start.
There's an idle week in the middle of that too. So you have a chance to get on a roll there before you get Iowa State and Texas back to back, and those are both at home, right? So you're sort of setting up for that, making that big run. But I think when the expectations are this high, where this does feel like you said, this is like 2011, like this could be your Big 12 championship kind of team. The bar has been set really high, and in the process of dealing with the Mike Gundy problem this offseason, or this summer at Oklahoma State, they went and totally redid his contract and made it so that the buyout to get rid of him at the end of this year is greatly reduced. So it's sort of like they've totally flipped the leverage on that, where it's like you do wonder if this thing falls apart, if they lose a couple games and it just sort of rolls right off the tracks there, will it sort of crank up the pressure? Now, of course, Ralph, you and I could probably agree, no one wants to be paying any buyouts this offseason, right? No one's got the money to do that. But I do think that that dynamic has changed a little bit where, could this could either be an incredible year for the program, or, it could be, I don't want to say the beginning of the end, but for Gundy, but this could go off in a very different direction as well.
Max Olson from The Athletic. We had such good fun talking to you. I always enjoy the conversation that we just kept rolling along, and now I've kept you even longer than I wanted to. But this will be a very thorough Big 12 preview, and we'll see if it holds up. Right, Max?
Please publish this as soon as possible. Everyone, please listen to it as soon as possible and download this knowledge, because for all we know, I don't know, Ralph, did you have TweetDeck open while we were talking? For all I know, this whole thing could have gone to hell while we were in the middle of taping it. Right?
Yeah, so I did have TweetDeck open while we were talking, and the only significantly bad news was the number of COVID cases on Notre Dame's campus tripled in a day.
Oh, okay.
So
that's, by the way, so I looked at my phone on Saturday, and it said that I had spent 14 hours on the Twitter app on my phone over the last week. It is. I don't think that's very healthy, But
No.
This is where we're at now, where you're just it's so 24/7. Like Brian Hainline goes on CNN at midnight to drop these big quotes. You have to be constantly on alert for what could be coming with this stuff, and it is, buddy, it is exhausting at times.
Yeah, it's been quite a ride. I am going to be, for 1,000 reasons, I am going to be very happy when we have gotten the pandemic in order and life goes back to somewhat normal, for reasons more important than college football, of course, but really just, what it has done to our workspace. I always kid around with the NFL just has the stupidest controversies, right? The NFL,
yes.
the news that comes out of the NFL is often just mind-bogglingly stupid. And I often kid around with my colleagues who cover the NFL that, as bad as college football can be on many levels with its scandals and things along those lines, far and away, I would never want to cover the NFL because of the mountain of stupidity that comes out of the NFL. And I got to tell you, college football is just taking the mantle as far as again, I don't want to trivialize it as stupidity, but just how complicated and just the layers of news that are being generated. And again, how complicated things are right now, where you see the other sports sort of, plotting in different ways, and some going about great, like in a bubble, and baseball having its sputtering, and we'll see what happens with football. But there is a sense of normalcy around all the other sports, and college sports is just in a ditch spinning its wheels. And I'm just like, why can't my sport be better? Anyway.
Yeah, it's such an emotional roller coaster these past few months, where there's, within every day, there's moments when you see some of this testing data come out, and you're like, okay, that's great. That's good progress, right? And then there's things that pop up, and you're just like, what are we doing here? Why this is a joke that we're still trying to believe that this is possible. And there's just a little bit. There's just all of that is sprinkled into every day, right?
It
now.
is.
It's
hour
so
to hour.
It's hard to kind of stay centered in all of this in terms of staying focused on the parts of this that matter, and in trying to not end up on too far on one side of the spectrum of opinion with this stuff either. But it's, buddy, it is a challenging time, and I certainly, these coaches and ADs are certainly earning their money right now.
Max Olson from The Athletic, thanks for previewing the Big 12 with me today. Take care, be safe, and hopefully we get a chance to maybe even see each other in person someday in the near future.
I would love to see you in a press box. Thanks, buddy.
And now 3 and out. First down. Max mentioned the blue chip ratio, which I'm guessing most of you who listen to this show are familiar with. But just in case, a quick explanation. The blue chip ratio is the work of Bud Elliott, who is with 24/7 Sports. He has also been a guest on this show at least once, I think in the last year. All national championship winners during what can be considered the recruiting rating era, say about 2000, maybe a little later than that, have had rosters comprised of at least 50% 4- and 5-star recruits. 15 teams are at that mark coming into the 2020 season. Alabama, Georgia, and Ohio State are at the top of the list, each above 80%. Texas is next in line with a group in the mid-60s. That group also includes LSU, Oklahoma, Clemson, and Florida. Second down. One of the interesting things about Clemson's rise is the Tigers have in some ways outperformed their recruiting rankings, which are very good and have gotten better as they have continued to win big and win national championships, but have not consistently been at the level of, say, Alabama or Ohio State, or even in the short period of time that Kirby Smart has been at Georgia. So why is that? Why do the Tigers and Dabo Swinney seem to perform better than their recruiting rankings? Well, one of the reasons is it definitely helps to be in the ACC. Sorry, Tiger fans, but that's just the truth. I don't think that's the biggest reason, though. The bigger reasons, though, I think are these. One, Clemson has gone from one elite quarterback in Deshaun Watson to another in Trevor Lawrence with just a 1-year gap in between. Elite quarterback play is worth more than elite left tackle play or elite cornerback play. A great quarterback raises the level of the team more than a great player at any other position. The other thing Clemson has done very well at is being really good at recruiting at the positions that really matter, like cornerback, like defensive end and defensive lineman, those places that really elevate the team more than just maybe a linebacker or a running back would. Though they've been good just about everywhere, they have been really good at the positions that really change the game. 2, Clemson has a high hit rate among its most elite recruits. Most of them tend to pan out and become big-time players. 3, retention and development. Clemson also does a really good job of keeping its players in the program. So even the ones that don't turn out to be stars tend to become contributors with experience and maturity. That's a valuable thing in college football, where a 22-year-old that knows what he is doing can be equally as valuable, maybe even more valuable than an 18 or 19-year-old 5-star who is just winging it. Third down. Back to the Big 12. In recent years, what I would normally do is make my own predictions after we preview the conference, but I haven't quite felt up to that because I don't know if I'm quite studied up enough to make those type of predictions. Maybe at some point before a season starts, I will put those down on paper, publish my predictions as I would in a normal year, but as of right now, again, I still don't know if I'm quite up to speed with all else that's going on in college sports. However, I will say this about the Big 12. In recent years, you could have given me Oklahoma or the field in the Big 12, and I probably would have been inclined to take Oklahoma. Last year was, I think, a year where I picked against Oklahoma, so maybe not last year. I felt like as we mentioned with Max, the gap has been closing a little bit. But this year, I would definitely take the field over Oklahoma in the Big 12. That's not to say the Sooners aren't worthy of being preseason favorites and aren't the favorite, and I certainly wouldn't be surprised if Oklahoma ends up winning another Big 12 title. I just think that things are lined up there enough with just enough uncertainty at quarterback and just enough injuries and suspensions and good players opting out that if the season does go off, there's enough talent in some of these contenders like Oklahoma State and Texas that maybe this is the year Oklahoma's streak gets snapped. That's the show for today. I'd like to thank my producer, Warren Levinson, for making me sound good. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts and Westwood One Podcast. Please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. Thanks for listening, and come back for more next week of the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast.
This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.